This is Jamie, and he's got a problem that's been quietly driving him insane for the past 2 years. See, Jamie is not a reckless spender. He meal preps. He makes a grocery list before he goes to the store. He sticks to it. He doesn't throw random stuff in the cart. He is, by any reasonable measure, a responsible adult who knows what things cost. Except lately, Jamie keeps standing at the checkout counter staring at a total that makes absolutely no sense to him. Because the items in his cart are the same items he's always bought. Same brands, same quantities, same store. And yet the number on that screen keeps going up. So Jamie does what any reasonable person does. He Googles it. And the headlines tell him not to worry, because inflation is cooling down. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates. Supply chains have stabilized. The worst is behind us. Experts say so. The government says so. The grocery store loyalty app even sent him a notification congratulating him on his savings. And yet Jamie is paying more than he was 2 years ago, more than he was last year, more than he was 6 months ago. And the items in his cart have also quietly gotten smaller. He's sure of it.
He's sure of it. That yogurt used to be bigger. That bag of chips has more air in it than product. That orange juice carton is definitely shorter than it used to be. Jamie isn't losing his mind. He's noticing something real, something the inflation headlines don't fully explain. Because here's the thing nobody is saying loudly enough. Your grocery bill isn't rising because of inflation. Not anymore. This is the grocery price scam explained.
But before we get into the mechanics, we need to understand what inflation actually is and what it isn't, because these two things are getting dangerously confused in public conversation right now. Inflation is a measure of the average rise in prices across the economy over time. When the cost of raw materials goes up, when fuel gets more expensive, when wages rise, businesses face higher input costs, and some of that gets passed to consumers. That's the basic, textbook version. And from 2021 through 2023, a genuine version of this happened. Supply chains were wrecked, energy prices spiked, labor markets tightened, and grocery prices did legitimately rise as a result. Nobody is disputing that part. The problem is what happened next, because by 2024, those input costs started falling. Commodity prices dropped, shipping costs normalized, supply chains stabilized. And if the original price hikes were caused by rising input costs, then falling input costs should mean falling prices at the shelf, right? That's how it works in a competitive, functional market. Except the prices didn't come down. They stayed elevated, and in many categories, they kept climbing. So if the input costs driving the original inflation came back down and the prices didn't follow, something else is going on. And that something else has a name.
The first thing Jamie needs to understand is shrinkflation. And if he hasn't heard the word before, he's definitely felt the effects. Because shrinkflation is exactly what it sounds like. The price stays the same, or even drops slightly, but the amount of product inside the package quietly decreases. Same shelf, same box, same brand, same price tag. Less food. No announcement, no apology, just a few less ounces and a little more empty space in the bag. Jamie noticed it with his chips. He noticed it with his yogurt. He noticed it with his coffee. And he is right, because this is documented and measurable. Consumer research organizations and government statistics agencies in multiple countries have tracked shrinkflation across hundreds of product categories. Potato chip bags, cereal boxes, canned goods, toilet paper rolls, candy bars. The examples run into the hundreds. And the mechanism is clever, because consumers are highly sensitive to price changes. If a product goes from $3 to $3.50, people notice, people react, people switch brands. But if the price stays at $3 and the bag drops from 16 ounces to 14 ounces, most people don't notice at all. They just go home slightly more hungry and slightly more confused about why their groceries feel like they didn't stretch as far this week. Shrinkflation is a price increase wearing a disguise, and it works because the human brain anchors to the number on the price tag, not the math of cost per ounce.
But shrinkflation is only the first layer, because while that was happening at the product level, something even more revealing was happening at the corporate level. And the evidence isn't hidden. It's in the public earnings call transcripts, available to anyone who wants to read them.
Because here's the thing about publicly traded companies. Every quarter, their executives get on a call with Wall Street analysts and tell them exactly how the business is performing and exactly what the strategy is going forward. These calls are recorded, transcribed, and published. And during 2022, 2023, and into 2024, while the public narrative was entirely focused on supply chains and inflation and global disruption, the executives of major consumer packaged goods companies were saying something very different to their investors. They were using a phrase that kept showing up on these calls over and over again: pricing power. As in, we have demonstrated strong pricing power in this environment. Our pricing actions are holding. Consumers are absorbing our price increases better than expected. We see continued opportunity to optimize pricing going forward. These aren't paraphrases. These are the kinds of statements that were made on the record by executives at some of the largest food companies in the world. In the same months, their PR teams were telling journalists that prices were high because of supply chains and input costs and things outside anyone's control. The term economists started using for this was greedflation, which is a blunter way of describing a company using an inflationary environment as cover to raise prices beyond what their actual cost increases would justify, pocketing the difference as expanded profit margin.
And the profit margins tell the story clearly. Because if price hikes were purely reactive to rising input costs, you'd expect profit margins to stay roughly flat. Companies pay more, they charge more, margins stay the same. That's cost pass-through. But that's not what the margin data showed. Profit margins at major food and consumer goods companies expanded during this period, which means they weren't just passing costs through. They were charging more than their rising costs required and keeping the difference.
Now, some economists push back on the greedflation framing and argue that companies always try to maximize profit and that there's nothing unusual about this. And technically, they're not wrong about the first part. Companies do always try to maximize profit. The question isn't whether they tried. The question is whether the market structure allowed them to succeed. Because in a genuinely competitive market, a company that raises prices above what costs justify gets undercut by a competitor who doesn't. Consumers switch, the price gouging company loses market share, prices come back down. That's the theory. The reason it didn't happen in your grocery store is the third and most structural layer of this whole story, and it comes down to how few companies actually control what's on the shelves. Because when Jamie walks down the cereal aisle, he sees dozens of different boxes from what looks like dozens of different brands. He sees the store brand, he sees the national brand, he sees the organic version and the family size version and the limited edition version. It looks like competition. It isn't. Because the consumer packaged goods industry is dominated by a remarkably small number of parent companies. A handful of corporations own the overwhelming majority of brand names across virtually every grocery category you can think of. Breakfast cereal, snack foods, beverages, condiments, frozen meals, dairy, bread. The brands look different. The logos look different. The marketing looks different. But trace the ownership and you find the same small group of companies sitting at the top. Which means when Jamie decides he's sick of one brand's price increase and switches to a competitor, there's a decent chance he's just handing his money to the same parent company through a different label. And what this oligopoly structure means in practice is that the normal competitive pressure that would force prices back down after input costs ease simply doesn't exist at the scale needed to make a difference. When the top 4 or 5 players in a category all raise prices in the same period, there's no major alternative for consumers to flee to. So the prices hold, and they stay held. And that's before we even get to the retail side of the equation, because the grocery retail industry itself is also highly consolidated. A small number of large supermarket chains control the majority of grocery retail in most US markets. And these retailers have their own pricing strategies, their own loyalty programs, their own private label products, and their own data on exactly what consumers will and won't accept before they walk out. They know from their own transaction data that most consumers will absorb a certain level of price increase before changing behavior. They know which categories are price sensitive and which are not, and they use that information. So you have a consolidated manufacturer side setting prices high, feeding into a consolidated retail side with the leverage and data to hold those prices up,
And in the middle is Jamie, armed with a loyalty card and a weekly circular, being told he's getting a deal.
So let's go back to Jamie at that checkout counter. The total on that screen is higher than it should be, and here's why. The original input cost spike from 2021 and 2022 was real. But when those input costs started falling, the price relief at the shelf didn't follow, because the companies selling the food and the companies selling the shelf space both discovered that in a consolidated market with limited alternatives, they didn't have to pass the savings on. And while that was happening, some of those same products quietly got smaller. So Jamie is now paying more for less in a market with too few real alternatives to vote with his wallet in any meaningful way, while the public conversation remains focused on macroeconomic inflation figures that technically have improved, even as his actual lived experience at the grocery store has not. The narrative of inflation as the villain is doing enormous work here, because it frames the grocery bill as an act of nature, something that happened to companies and consumers alike, equally, without intention. But the earnings call transcripts, the margin data, and the shrinkflation tracking all point in the same direction. The prices were raised more than costs required. The profits expanded. And the smaller packages were a way to extract even more from a consumer who was already being told the worst was over.
None of this is a secret. All of it is documented. The information exists in public filings, public transcripts, published research, and government statistical databases. It just requires someone to put it together in one place and say it plainly. Jamie isn't bad at math. His grocery bill isn't high because he's spending too much. It's high because in a market this consolidated, nobody had a real reason to bring it back down. So the next time you stand at that checkout counter and the number on the screen makes no sense to you, remember that you are not imagining it. You're just being correctly billed for a system that figured out exactly how much it can take before you stop coming back. And the answer, unfortunately, is quite a lot.
Stay sharp out there, and I'll see you in the next one.